Chapter 24 review. Chapter 24 introduces the concept of macroevolution. You've already studied microevolution, which is a change in a population's gene pool. Macroevolution is defined as the origin of a new taxonomic group, which can include the origin of a new species, which is what Chapter 24 is about. Now, in order to understand the origin of species, we must first define species. Now, the definition in your book is provided by Ernst Mayr under the phrase biological species concept. In paraphrase, it's basically a group of populations whose individuals have the natural capability to interbreed or interbreed in nature, but these individuals are reproductively isolated from other such groups. In a nutshell, what this definition is saying is that members of a species have the potential to interbreed in nature, but not with members of different species. So to understand that, we have to look at reproductive isolation or reproductive barriers. In your textbook, figure 24.4 is a two-page spread discussing reproductive isolation. Now, reproductive isolation keeps separate species separate. They're in two different categories, prezygotic and postzygotic. A prezygotic barrier prevents fertilization. Okay? Now, a postzygotic barrier prevents hybrid success. Now, those that prevent fertilization include habitat isolation, where two species don't interbreed because they breed in different habitats, temporal isolation, where two species breed at different times, behavioral isolation, in which species courtship behaviors are incompatible, mechanical isolation, in which it's physically impossible to undergo the act of mating between two species, or gametic isolation, where the gametes could meet but they simply don't fertilize. Now again, this figure in your book gives you examples. Read over the examples. Postzygotic isolation mechanisms prevent hybrid success. There are three. There's hybrid inviability, meaning that the hybrid either dies or is frail. Hybrid sterility, meaning that the hybrid could be healthy but cannot produce gametes. Or hybrid breakdown, which means that if a hybrid is viable and fertile, but tries to interbreed with either parental species or with each other, leads to a breakdown in that generation. So again, your textbook has examples, and so does your notes. So logic would dictate that for a new species to occur, that is for speciation to occur, you have to have the origin of a reproductive isolating mechanism where you didn't have one before. Now, in our notes, Roman numeral 2 talks about modes of speciation. Speciation is basically when populations of a species diverge into separate species. Two modes of speciation are discussed: allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Allopatric speciation is speciation caused by geographic isolation of populations. So if you have two populations that are geographically isolated and each is undergoing microevolution on its own, then what you can have over time is accumulated differences in the gene pool between the populations. Gene pool differences could accumulate to the point where there could become a reproductive isolation mechanism. In your notes, I've given you examples of patterns in nature that show allopatric speciation. Under letter B in sympatric speciation, this is speciation without geographic isolation. This can be due to two things. One is habitat differentiation, also known as strong diversifying selection. I discussed the apple maggot fly in that situation. And the other is by polyploidy, figure 24.11 and 24.12. With polyploidy in plants, an accidental doubling or tripling of the chromosome number could produce a new species of plant. In fact, that has been the case with a number of agriculturally important plants, including wheat. So make sure you look at these examples in your book. Now, back in the notes under allopatric speciation, I discussed adaptive radiation, which can happen with either mode. Adaptive radiation is the origin of many species relatively quickly from one or a few. This can happen in fragmented habitats, such as the isolated lakes of Death Valley or oceanic islands with 13 species of finches of the Galapagos Islands, for example. Again, the examples are in your notes. The last portion of the chapter discusses evolutionary rates. Darwin himself proposed that evolutionary rates were slow, steady, gradual, and constant. That's known as gradualism in terms of how fast this happens. Now, of course, if you read through my examples, you'll notice that there's no basis to assume that any of this is going to happen at a constant rate. It's all a case-by-case scenario. One of my examples talks about speciation of Drosophila fruit flies in only a couple of decades. Yet sycamore trees can remain separated by 70 million years and still be interfertile when you bring them together. So geographic isolation does not mean that they have to evolve into separate species. It simply means that they can. So everything's a case-by-case basis. The problem with gradualism in terms of overall rates is that the fossil record doesn't show gradual, slow, steady, constant. It shows jumpy, 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 jumpy. Well, more recently, Eldridge and Gould proposed punctuated equilibrium. The idea that evolutionary rates over long periods of time are not slow, steady, gradual, and constant, but jumpy, 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 jumpy. It's a description of relatively long periods of time with little changing going on, interrupted by or punctuated by relatively short periods of time with relatively rapid adaptive radiation. They use this to describe the fossil record in terms of mass extinctions followed by adaptive radiation of the survivors. And that is most of the notes from Chapter 24.